a person who's not got a lot of money and just about to retire in Singapore, for example. Or if you're a civil engineer like me and think it's just great, how can you possibly have a city of 5 million people where you can go from A to B in 20 minutes in most cases? That's amazing. That's magic. How do you do it? You know, this is great. And just talking about transport, we'll talk about public housing and everything like that. There's so much good stuff that we've heard tonight, and I've learned a lot. So let's go to the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Let's have some good questions for the panel. Who would like to start? Prasenjit?
Thank you. I too, like Professor Smith, have a much greater and even greater respect for Singapore after having heard these presentations. But you know, I have two questions about the idea of the model. And they're not sort of metaphysical questions about model, but to what extent can Singapore be a model? And the first one is, was evolving as I heard each one of you speak. And finally, it got answered in some ways, but I'm still going to subject you to a short version of it. When Dr. Cheong first talked about how the difference really with Singapore and all other cities that try to replicate Singapore is that it is compact, that you don't have, and all the, I think, speakers said that, you don't have these multiple levels. So the issue is not one of size, but of scales, right? So the scales are compounded in Singapore, whereas you have the same size in a place like Shanghai, but you have several scales of ministries competing and administration. So my question at the end was, and coming finally to Kiang's idea that, or first to Mr. Khoo, that the Chinese cities, which Singapore has helped develop parts of cities, like Tianjin Eco-City and things like that, I got the sense that it could be done to a certain extent because of land policies, right? So then my question here is, and then coming to Kiang, is that a place like Bombay, what is the difference in land policy in a place, between a place like Bombay and Singapore? I mean, why they both evolved out of British colonial situations. Why is it easier for Singapore to be able to plan cities on land which is privately owned, or as much, presumably, as in a place like Bombay? My second quick question is, what we at ARI are doing, looking now at, is very much disaster governance. Disasters as a kind of a new normal for cities all over the world. In that sense, Singapore is also an exception, isn't it? I mean, how much is Singapore subject to disasters? And how much does Singapore, I mean, to some extent I can see Singapore responds to possibilities of water shortage and things like that. But, you know, other kinds of compounded disasters that are now emerging increasingly. Sorry for those long.
Okay, all right. I guess the first question is for you, right, Kiang? What's the fundamental difference between Mumbai and Singapore? We were both formerly British colonies. Is it land? Is that in the case of Singapore, most of the land is owned by the state, and in India, most of the land is owned by individuals? Is that a fundamental difference?
Well, I think there's that, and also the governance as well. It's compounded. I think the two issues makes it far more complex. I mean, we do have some instruments, especially in the early years, where if I'm not wrong, soon after our independence, or rather in the 40s, the government had a control of about 40% or so of land, that's all, ownership. But thanks to Land Acquisition Act and land reclamation, that percentage grew. And with our, I would say, one-party system, the ability to make difficult decisions and to implement them makes all the difference. Yeah.
I think a fundamental difference is the Land Acquisition Act. In Singapore, the ownership of land is not protected by the Constitution. Yeah, it was deliberately left out because Lee Kuan Yew believed that he has to be a Robin Hood to rob the rich in order to help the poor. And so he was able to acquire land compulsorily from private landowners and often pay them at below the market value. You know? And no, it's true, it's true.
Yes,
I mean,
it's true.
It's true. And you know, you can, I mean, this is an example of socialism in practice. But could I just make one point about Bombay, yeah? Because I co-chair the India-Singapore Strategic Dialogue, and my Indian friends have challenged me to say, if we were to make available to Singapore a large parcel of land, would Singapore help India to build a new Bombay? Something like Pudong to Shanghai, you know? Teng Chye.
Just to add on to Professor Tommy Koh's point about land acquisition, I mean, I think if you look at the context in the 50s and 60s, to begin the process of urban renewal was really a nightmare. I mean, we had the Jackson Plan, but Raffles was very creative. He came out with the 5-foot way and the shop houses, which all had very narrow frontage. But you know, for a modern city where you need to have assembled at least several of these shop houses to be able to put up a decent office building, that would have been almost impossible if you just leave it to the landowners. That's one problem, very fragmented ownership. And number two, the British introduced rent control after the Second World War. So a lot of the owners were actually absentee landlords in the sense that their houses were leased to tenants at very, very low rentals, and they had no incentive to look after these shop houses. Many of them had trees growing in them and so on. So the conditions were really quite appalling. And actually the Land Acquisition Act was really a very good instrument to really begin the process of urban renewal.
Koon, please.
Yeah, I thought I'd just add on to this conversation. I think what Kiang said is very, very interesting. That the situation is different. There are contextual differences, land ownership, the type of governance. Yes, all these are different. But in my own experience with dealing with many of these cities that come to us, every year we host thousands of visitors who come and try and ask us, so what can we learn from you? We never say you can learn from us, but we share with you what we have done. And they have to look at the context. But I'm a little bit more optimistic than Kiang. Because the business of city management is very complex. It deals with politics. There's a professional part of it, which is all the stuff I talk about. How you do a plan, you know. Even whether you have land acquisition powers, that is a professional issue to a certain extent. Because we're not the only city in the world that has land acquisition. Actually, most cities have land acquisition acts. The problem is the government is powerless to use it because there's no political will. They'll be booted out of power. So that becomes political, all right? So the professional part of the tool, the bag of tools that you use to develop a city, I think that can be learned. But the question is whether you can implement it. So many cities come to us, and Singapore trains hundreds of mayors from China. Suzhou, to me, Suzhou Industrial Park, which is a misnomer, it's actually not an industrial park. It started as an industrial park, but now it's grown into looking at the CBD and the entire city. It's actually Suzhou Master Plan, I call it. It's really not just the industrial park. To me, it's a big milestone in the history of planning in China, because they finally, it's about a transfer of software that enabled them to learn the processes and the systems. And if you visit Suzhou today, they have a working model that seems to work. And it is pretty holistic and it's very impressive. I was involved in the Tianjin city master plan. In fact, I worked on the master plan when the first master plan. I don't know whether the shape is still the same. That's one of the problems with China is to stick to the plan, you know. And they have great difficulty because, I mean, it's the system, all right? Every time you change leadership,